Welcome back to Star Wars Timeline. My name is Ben. In today's video, we're talking about Beilert Valance. He's the character that I did a short 60-second video on, and once I threw it on Facebook groups, fans started barraging me with questions like, who's this Terminator looking guy? Where's he from? So in this video, we will talk about this character bio. I'll just give you a quick introduction, the concept of what this character is all about. We'll talk about his personality traits and skills. I will also discuss my personal impression of this character and what I hope to see in the future. If you guys enjoy this sort of content and my character highlights, please don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button. That would help me a great deal. Thanks a lot. Anyway, let's dive right into it. So who is this character? He is a mercenary and a bounty hunter and a smuggler, a character that was actually originated in Star Wars comic books from early Marvel days in 1977. That's right, guys. This character actually predates Terminator and all the recent Star Wars comic books, which we see obviously in the Bounty Hunter Wars and Bounty Hunters. He predates all of that. When Marvel used to own the comic books in the early Star Wars years, this is where a character pops up in issue number 16. So he is born as a human called Beilert Valance, and he's the son of these slave miners on a planet called Shinbone. So he leaves his home planet. He doesn't want this lifestyle for himself. He's able to buy out his freedom, and he leaves for Imperial Academy. He served with the Imperial Academy in the Outer Rim territories. He actually participated in a couple of crucial battles, and after serious injuries, he starts augmenting his body with cybernetic parts, because once they take him off the battlefield, it looks like the Empire seems to no longer require his services, and he is afraid that he will be no longer useful to the Empire, so he starts enhancing his body to stay in the fight. But regardless of that, he's discharged from the service. And what's interesting here is that the character is imported into modern Star Wars comic books, where his story is continued. We know recent comic book fans will obviously recognize him from the awesome book covers from the recent Bounty Hunter and Bounty Hunter Wars comic books. And this is where he becomes one of the most crucial figures. I would say probably one of the most notorious, recognizable, staple bounty hunters in the new Star Wars canon. So he apprentices with this other famous Notolan bounty hunter called Nakano Lash. And he becomes starts holding his own as a smuggler and bounty hunter and mercenaries. And after he's has a falling out with Nakano Lash, he kind of feels betrayed by her, because in the beginning of the recent Star Wars comic books, Nakano Lash takes him along with Dengar and a whole bunch of different bounty hunters. And in the middle of that operation, she decides to abandon her objective, and she actually goes for saving the daughter of one of the crime lords, which goes against their mission parameters. And all of those bounty hunters who she took on the mission with her, including Valance, felt very betrayed. And after that, he basically becomes a loner, very much like Boba Fett. He starts taking bounties. He has also falling out with his childhood love. He's on his own, and the more we start learning about this character, the more cybernetically he becomes. And even at one point in the comics, he's also responsible for indirectly helping the rebellion. And he has to assist them because his ex-lover is also part of that group, and he feels an obligation to help, if not the rebellion directly, but to her. So what is Valance's personality like? Even before he conscripts with the Empire and starts changing his body, we get this very cold outward appearance. He's very quiet, and he's reserved, and he's into himself. But we also know that deep within, he's a very passionate and emotional person, because later on, when he becomes a bounty hunter and a smuggler, the way that he reacts to different situations is very impassioned. So it's a very interesting contrast. You see this cold, calculating machine outwardly in appearance. He has almost like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Half of his face is constantly being erased, the skin is peeled off, and his mechanic parts are being revealed. But his personality is very hot-headed. He's always charging into combat, and he's ready just to take down names and kick everybody's ass. And we know that early from his youth that he's very a driven individual. He decides to break away from his home world after his parents passed away. He doesn't want that lifestyle, and he does everything that he needs to do to accomplish that goal. So you could also say that he's very task and goal-oriented person. And he has this uncompromising sense of duty and loyalty, regardless what faction that he's affiliated with in different stages of his life. Like, for example, early on when he conscripts with the Empire, it's not that he's a true believer, really, but you know that he knows what his mission is, he knows what he's required of him, and he will always go on and try to fulfill that task because he needs to belong somewhere. That's the kind of guy that he is. Later on, when his ship crash lands and he's waiting for recovery and the Empire is not there, one of the other Carillion cadets that comes to his rescue is actually no other than Han Solo. And it's interesting that they create this particular story arc early in Valance's career as an Imperial, and later on when he becomes a bounty hunter, which is basically an outlaw kind of organization where everybody fends for himself. He still remembers what Han Solo has done for him, and he feels a sense of loyalty and obligation to him, and that's partially why he decides to help the rebellion. Even when he is with Nakano Lesh, before this, his mentor, bounty hunter, betrays him. And once again, she does it for a good cause, for a noble cause. He recognizes that, and even though he wants to hunt her down and he feels very angry, he still feels a kind of kinship or loyalty to her. It's like, she's my mentor, you know, she taught me. And that's why the betrayal hits him so hard emotionally, because he couldn't believe that. He's like, hey, I invested so much of my life to you. How come you backstabbed me and betrayed me and the rest of the bounty hunters that you took on with you on this mission? He also has a sense of kinship to his ex-lover, Urala Vega, who becomes part of this rebel cell. And even though later during the rebellion, we know that she took on a new husband, she doesn't have the same feelings for Valance anymore, but he still feels, because of their shared past and they were childhood sweethearts, or when he was younger, he decides to help her, and he says, that's the right thing to do. I'm going to go and help out rebels over here. And there's an interesting and quite morbid and sad fatalism to this character as well. The more abandoned that he becomes, the more the suicidal he becomes, and he feels that his body is worthless, and the more he tries to modify it. But obviously, because he's still partly human, there is no peace in his heart and his soul. And in that contrast, I think that's what makes a very dynamic and interesting character. What was my personal impression of him? So, as many of Star Wars fans, I actually discovered him through the new Star Wars comic books. Even though I've been reading Star Wars comics for like 20 years, DC and early Marvel comic books here and there, I never realized who this guy was, because the early Marvel years of the comics is something that I still have to touch. I never knew those. I never knew his origin. And I learned him from these new comic books, and I was immediately blown away by this character. Not because he's an entirely original character, he's really not. But I would argue that Beilert Valance makes it for a great Star Wars character because of the sum of all the parts that are included. It's a perfect instance of where you don't need to reinvent the wheel if you tell the character and his story well, effectively, right? And that's the case here. I felt that his story was very human and very relatable, you know, that he has this lost love, and his debt to Han Solo was very, very interesting to me personally. You know, once again, it's not going to score any originality points here, but just because how he's tied into Han Solo's life and his ex-lover and the Empire, his interaction with other bounty hunters and Vader, made up for an interesting character that I couldn't turn to the next page and discover what happens to him next. In a way, I would say that he is a spin-off of Darth Vader character. It's almost like if you take video games, you always have, to every Ryu, you have Ken, right? An alternate version of the character that functions somewhat differently. And this is also the instance with Valance. So he is an Imperial, right, who is injured and becomes more cybernetically enhanced, just like Vader. The twist here is that he's not a true believer. He leaves the Empire and he becomes independent entity, right? He becomes a smuggler. If Vader always till his dying day as the Emperor's henchman, this guy is more independent, he's more self-assertive, and he carves his own destiny in the Star Wars galaxy. Also, what I really enjoyed about him, and once again, once I threw that 60-second video on Facebook groups, fans immediately started saying like, hey, this is a ripoff of Terminator, right? Who is this guy? Because I assume because they saw more recent artwork of him, not the old artwork. I'll try to throw one or two pictures on screen so you guys could appreciate what he looks like early in 1977. And suddenly you realize and understand where the Terminator character, James Cameron version, comes from. He's actually coming from Valance's character because he's like 5 or 7 years older than Terminator movies. I was like, oh my God, this is pretty interesting. This is fun stuff. To have a character in Star Wars who has that staple look. And, you know, I'm not that well read in terms of comic books at large, but I would surmise that even during the pulpy era, during like golden age 50s and 60s, and maybe even early on, you did have instances of these robotic or cybernetic kind of like characters with half of the skin ripped off from their face. And I'm pretty sure Valance is perhaps not the original creation in that regard, because as we know, Isaac Asimov's positronic brain and cyborg creations, the novels that he wrote in 50s and 60s, he popularized the idea of a human-looking machine that looks outwardly, by all intents and purposes, like humans, but on the inside, they're machines. That's where Valance is from. That's where Terminator borrows from. Anyway, I was very impressed with this character. I enjoyed him a lot. So what are my hopes for the future for the Beilert Valance? Obviously, we have the Book of Boba Fett, a TV show just dropping out, and this is an opportune moment for me to make this video and express the thought. It's like, hey, what if we actually get Valance in the new Boba Fett series? There is no reason not to do him, right? Because we know that Valance is already there during the Galactic Civil War, so he's maybe along the same age group as Boba Fett, somewhere in that range. And if he's cybernetically enhanced, it stands to reason that he ages much slower. So maybe he will show up. Maybe we'll see him. I don't know, if he picked up really well with the current Marvel comic books audience, maybe they'll put them in the show as well. I also just recently watched and reviewed the Droids show on Star Wars Vintage Classics from the Disney Plus, and you guys could check out my reviews on the channel. But I was actually quite impressed with it because we also see a couple of bounty hunters. Obviously, Boba Fett shows up, and it sort of pushes me thinking, hey, like, what if we get another animated show? I don't care if it's like CGI animated show, if it's traditional hand-drawn animation, but what if we have a show dedicated specifically to bounty hunters, and Valance is like one of the lead stars in there? Because once again, I thought he worked really well in the comic books. He really stood out from the rest of them, and I think as a central figure in his own series, or in the bounty hunter series, he would work really well. And last but not least, I would like to see other cybernetically enhanced Imperials in Star Wars. Not just Valance, not just Vader, but others. And the reason I'm saying that, when I was a kid growing up with Star Wars in the 80s in Russia, and the moment that I saw Darth Vader and that he's like this machine-looking person, he's almost looking like a Dark Knight, like a medieval swordsman, I automatically had a picture in my mind that he's not the only one. There got to be more enforcers, these black armor-wearing lieutenants or henchmen that the Emperor has spread across the galaxy. And obviously, they play into that children's fantasy by introducing the Inquisitors in the Star Wars Rebels show. That was, to me, like a grand revelation. I looked at that and I said, oh my God, this is really cool. But what if they were more like Vader and more cybernetic? So you see where I'm coming from? Valance gave me an idea that, like, hopefully we'll have more Imperials with cybernetic parts that just look badass, or somebody like Darth Malak from the Knights of the Old Republic games. Anyway, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know, how did you discover Beilert Valance, and if you enjoy him as much as other bounty hunters. And once again, don't forget to subscribe. I'll hit you more with Star Wars character highlights in this year, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.